Thanks for coming out. We already have a lot of Army people standing here, but I'd like to invite any other veterans that are Army to either stand or raise your hands, please. All right. Hand for the Army, all right. I know we have at least one Coastie in here. Any more Coasties? Raise your hand, there's one Coastie. Any Marines? I know we got a Marine. Someone back here. Air Force guys, I know Don's at Air Force. Anybody else? Do I have any shipmates here? Any retired Navy other than myself? All right, shipmate. All right, good. Thanks for coming. All right, I'm going to talk about the Native American code talkers. First of all, I'm neither a Native American nor a code talker, so I'm certainly not an expert, not a cryptologist either, so don't expect a lot. I did spend about 20 years, part of it reserve time, as a Navy intelligence officer, but for me, you need to know that intelligence is an avocation, not an attribute. So for you Marines, that means it's something I did, not something that I have. Okay. All right. Thanks, Arlen. All right. Thanks for letting me use you as the brunt of the joke. I appreciate it. Okay. I do have a little experience in communications and cryptography. My first job on my first destroyer. I was a tin can sailor for 10 years before I went into intelligence. First job. Can everybody hear me okay? First of all, okay. Was a communications officer on an old tin can, and as part of that job, I was the cryptologic materials custodian. So I was responsible for maintaining all the coding material for our secure communications. And of course, I think that one of the first things I did was, as a CMS custodian, was turn in for destruction the rotors from the old manual typewriter type coding machines, like the German Enigma machines. Beyond that, most of our coding material was computer cards. Nowadays, the coding material, most of it, is on a flash drive. That's what they use nowadays for your coding keys. All right. Let's see if I can go here. Okay. First of all, I love this slide. Take a second to read that. The picture I just got, it was credited to PBS, but the scripture there I think is pretty remarkable. My first interest in cryptography was when I was a kid. I liked to read Edgar Allan Poe, and I read a story called The Gold Bug. Does anybody remember that story? And it involved a sort of a treasure and a little piece of parchment that the guy was able to decode, and one of the reasons he was able to decode it was because there was repetitive characters. It was a simple cipher where one character takes the place of another character. Okay, kind of like your old decoder ring that you got with your Buster Brown shoes when you were a kid. I think many of us can remember Buster Brown shoes. So that's just a simple cipher. Well, one of the ways, the best way to break a cipher, it's kind of like the scramble thing in the paper. If you see a repetitive pattern, 3 letters, it repeats itself. The most common word that repeats itself in the English languages is THE. So if you see a lot of 3 characters together, THE, oh, that's probably either THE or AND. So you start substituting characters, and after a while, you can break the code. And that was fascinating to me as a little kid. But we go on now. Some of you may have read, if you've read about the cryptanalysts in World War II, where we were able to break the Japanese diplomatic code, which if we'd used that information properly, we could have avoided the disaster of Pearl Harbor. The purple code, which was the Japanese fleet code, and then the German Enigma machines. There's a great stories, great history about that. I encourage you to read about it if you're not familiar with it. Nowadays, believe it or not, it's gotten, because of the amazing advances, in computer science, they're actually pursuing, and they may be doing it. I don't have those clearances anymore, where they're using quantum cryptography, where they're using different quantum states of matter to create codes. And you could actually make a case that they're actually doing cryptography in parallel universes. It's remarkable. All right. Many of you, how many people have seen this movie, Wind Talkers? Not a great movie, but interesting. Probably my favorite Native American actor, Adam Beach, is in that movie, does a great job. We're mostly familiar with the Navajo Code Talkers because they're the more numerous, and they're the ones that have been publicized and celebrated more than any of the other tribes that have done it. But in fact, there were actually 420 of them that served in World War II. But in fact, at least 20, and by some counts, close to 30 tribes have been used, tribal languages have been used in some shape, form, or fashion for secure communications in World War I and World War II, and possibly other ones, but I don't have any information on that. Other tribes that had significant participation are the Sac and Fox, Chippewa, close to 20, Choctaw, and you'll hear about that. We'll talk about the Choctaws, Hopi, some of our Plains tribes, some Sioux were used, and actually there are some Cree that were used by the Canadian Army in World War II during D-Day. Not all these languages were used in a coded form. Some of them were just merely Native Americans, and I'm going to say Indians. It takes a lot less time to say it. I don't think it offends anyone. A lot of they call themselves American Indians, but I'll probably use that term more than anything else just out of efficiency. Not all languages were used in coded form. Some they just basically spoke in their own language, and they would have to interject military terms that there was no Native American term for, so those weren't as secure. But for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to talk primarily about the Choctaw, the Comanche, and the Navajo. Okay, why Indians? Why Native American languages? A good tactical code is secure, accurate, instantaneous, and durable. Okay, the native languages, most Native American languages are secure because they're unwritten. Okay, what's the greatest exception to that? Can anybody suggest? Sequoia came up with a syllabary. It's not like a dictionary. A syllabary is it's a list of syllables. They say that character for syllables, not characters for sounds. That's why it's called a syllabary. So Sequoia, Cherokee wouldn't be a great choice because it's been studied a lot and it's written. Now, some of the other languages have been transcribed these days, but for the time periods that we're talking about, except for Cherokee, almost none of the languages had there been any serious or broad attempts to try to come up with them in a written form. So if it's not written down, that means it's that helps its security. Some Japanese and German scholars and scientists were over in the pre-World War II years studying Native American languages under other pretenses, and many of those people were arrested and deported because they, in fact, were spies because they had, in the case of the Germans, they had experienced Native American code talking in World War I. In the case of the Japanese, they had heard about it. The only way to break the code in terms of these Native American languages is to understand the language. And these languages, are there any Native Americans, any Indians here with us today? Great. Can I ask what tribe? Yeah, raise your hand.
Navajo.
Great. Oh, fantastic. Are you the lady that I spoke with on the phone?
I don't believe so.
Okay. All right. I may ask you, do you speak Navajo?
Oh, yes.
Do you mind if I call on you during the presentation to enunciate some things a little bit? Great. I appreciate that. Thank you. So she can tell you, and I invite you to chime in, that languages like Navajo, Kiowa, some of these languages are intensely tonal. A single sound in some of these languages can have as many as 10, 15, 20 different inflections, and each one of those inflections gives that word either a different meaning or a different context. Okay? So only native speakers could really be proficient code talkers. There were, and I've heard about at least one white man who was raised on a Navajo reservation who did serve a little bit as a code talker, but I don't think he served as part of a formal program. There were others that applied, and they couldn't perform. So you basically have to be raised in these languages to be proficient enough in them to do what they did with them. Okay, and of course, the codes that you'll see, the codes that they use were completely committed to memory. So if it's not written down, again, it's an unwritten language. It's completely secure. So that's why Native American English is accurate. It's accurate because it's just like any two of us having a conversation with each other. There's a high degree of understanding among us when we speak, okay? Because the code is part of us. It's just part of us. It's not a code. It's just we understand how to speak with each other. Well, the Native American code talkers were speaking in their own language, so they understood each other perfectly. So that makes it completely accurate. And of course, used with specific vocabulary and terminology, which we'll talk a little bit about. You can see why it would also be completely accurate because they committed these terms to memory. Okay, it's instantaneous. I talked about the computer cards that we use for the cryptologic materials, or that's called the key. You have to have that little tabulary or the magic decoder ring, the little thing that tells you an A is really an R, or an asterisk is really a V, or whatever. That all has to be written down in order for a regular code, or a computer card, or a flash drive, or whatever that we use these days. But with these codes, it was entirely committed to memory. There's no key required for translation or transliteration or anything. And durability, a good code is durable, very low likelihood of compromise, and because you don't have a key, there's no logistics required for the key, okay? In warfare, sometimes a runner would have to carry the code, the transliteration or the key, would have to get it in a Jeep or literally run to another place that needed it and give them the key so that they could break, unscramble what had been scrambled at the other end. And that takes a lot of time. So, and there's no logistics required for it. I don't have to send a runner. All I got to do is talk over the field telephone or over the radio. There's an example, and they're not very legible, but we'll have an opportunity to go over some of those a little bit later on. Okay, World War I. The arrowhead there, that's the emblem for the U.S. Army's 36th Division. And the code talkers, the formalized code talkers in World War I were Choctaw Indians that were in the U.S. 36th Division. It's a remarkable story. That's a picture of them in the upper left. The other pictures are just representative of, this is actually the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, a picture taken during the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, which was the primary success we talked about. These are not Native Americans, but it gives you an idea of something we'll talk about, how these battlefields were just strewn with wires. This here, and Bob Wilson's got this and one over there, is actually a field telephone. It's a sound-powered phone, a lot like the old crank telephones that our parents and grandparents used around here. So those wires had to be run across the battlefield to the rear lines or laterally or wherever to use those, crank the telephone and talk. And these wires were all over the battlefields. If one army pushed another army back, they would, in a hurry, they would have to abandon those lines. So that army would use those lines rather than string their own. Well, as a result, a lot of those lines would be tapped. They would leave a wire connected to it as they were retreating, and then they could hear the next guys hook up and then intercept their communication. So that's why the codes are extremely important. And that's an example of that there. I talked about these running messages one way or another. In World War I, about 1 out of every 4 runner who was trying to transfer communications to another place, if they didn't have radio or a field telephone, was captured. Well, you can imagine a lot of information was lost that way. The tactical codes that they did use were slow because it had to be encrypted manually at the sending end and decrypted manually at the receiving end. It takes a lot of time. It's very manpower intensive. So sometime before the Meuse-Argonne offensive, there was a Captain Lawrence in the 36th Division, and he was walking along the lines, and he heard some Native Americans speaking in their own language. And he said, "Hey, how many of you guys are there?" He goes, "There's 8 of us." He said, "Really?" He said, "Are there any in headquarters company?" "Yeah, there's 2 or 3 of them in headquarters. 2 or 3 of us in headquarters company." He says, "Okay." He got all the guys together. He did a demonstration for the division commander, and within hours, they set up, excuse me, they set up the first formal Native American code talking. Within hours, they reassigned people to headquarters company and the different field companies and set up Native American code talking in World War I. Meuse-Argonne offensive, September 1918. They found out that the Germans were going to do a big counter. This was our offensive, the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the Allied offensive. But the Germans were going to do a counterattack at 0700 the next morning. Native American code talkers reported everything they knew about that counterattack, set up a 0550 artillery barrage and a 0600 infantry attack to take place an hour before the German attack was to take place. As a result, the Germans suffered extremely heavy losses. Over 500 prisoners were taken. So this was the first code. They actually came up with some terms hurriedly to use in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Patrol, mini scouts. A grenade was a stone. A casualty, who can guess what a casualty was? Scalp. Okay? Artillery was a big gun. A machine gun was a little gun, shoot fast. Okay? A regiment was a tribe. They came up with these literally in hours so that they could communicate with each other. And the success in the Meuse-Argonne offensive was remarkable. Almost immediately, other Indian dialects were used in a less formal fashion, to include Cherokee, Cheyenne, Comanche, Osage, and some Yankton Sioux. We talked about that. I want to talk about this guy here, Joseph Oklahombi, quoted as saying, "Too much salute, not enough shoot." Okay? This guy was he was one of the Choctaw code talkers. He's the second greatest hero of the war. The first greatest in World War I would have been Allen C. York, right? Okay. Oklahombi, not as part of his code talking duties because he was an infantryman. He, with a small patrol, crossed over 200 yards under hostile fire, captured multiple pieces of enemy artillery and machine guns. They held the position for 2 days. With no rations or water. They captured 171 prisoners of war and killed 79. One of the stories is that the Germans were resting in a fenced-in, a walled-in graveyard cemetery, and they took one of the pieces that they captured, put it on the wall, and just shot Germans inside there until they surrendered. He was rewarded the Croix de Guerre, which is the highest French decoration, and the Silver Star. He declined it. He was offered the Hollywood treatment that Alvin C. York was offered. He declined it. Tragically, he was killed by being run over by a truck in 1960. I think my favorite little story I read about him was he at a different occasion, it was reported he was returning with 2 prisoners, and he came back with 1 prisoner. And the officer or the sergeant or someone said, "Where's your other prisoner?" And he said, "I killed him." And upon the officer appearing disappointed, Oklahombi said, "You want me to go back and kill him some more?" So, at any rate, how effective were the Indian code talkers in World War I? Very short period of time, but remarkable effectivity. The German counteroffensive, and the Meuse-Argonne offensive was stopped in less than 24 hours. A lot of credit given to the code talkers for this. In less than 72 hours, the Germans were in full retreat, and just weeks later, November 11th, we all, and many of us here remember when it was, and Misty talked about it, when it was called Armistice Day. So the armistice was just assigned weeks later. All right. Okay, the interwar period. Some interesting things going on. Basically, as a result, largely as a result of Native Americans, mostly as a result of Native Americans participating, because they enlisted in large numbers for World War I, were granted U.S. citizenship, but only the veterans were granted U.S. citizenship. So that was recognized. In 1924, all the other Native Americans were granted citizenship. The question has been asked, why? Was it a reward for their loyalty? Or was it an acknowledgement that they were no longer a threat to the United States? Now, that's something that can be discussed. 1940, the Selective Service Act, Indians became subject to the draft. But there was a lot of confusion regarding their U.S. citizenship versus tribal citizenship, wardship, those kinds of things. So later on in 1940, the Nationality Act cleared that up, and some other lawsuits cleared all that up, and it became clear that Native Americans were subject to the draft. Bottom line was Congress reserved the right to repeal or to suspend any treaty during emergency because of the treaties that existed between the United States and the tribes, not that the United States adhered to them very much in the first place. An interesting subnote to that is it wasn't until 1957 that the last state in the Union allowed Native Americans to vote, because voting was controlled by the states, not by the federal government. So I don't know which states they were, but they even held out even until 1957 to let Native Americans vote. Pretty disturbing. Any questions about anything so far? Can everybody hear me? All right. Okay. We're going to talk a little bit about how things got started in the European theater, and then how for Native American code talkers, and we'll talk mostly about the Comanche, and then we'll talk a little bit about the Pacific theater and how that got started, and then we'll just kind of talk generally about operations in each of those theaters for World War II. The U.S. Army had plans underway in 1940, before World War II, based on the World War I experiences, to use code talkers. They did some studies, and they decided they wanted to use the Comanche and the Hopi Indians, so they were recruited into the 4th Infantry, it's easy for me to say, 4th Infantry Division. Okay, and so in August of 1941, there had been some training done with some code talkers, so they participated in what's called the Great Louisiana Maneuvers. It's really interesting because up to that time, it was the largest exercises of U.S. Armed Forces that had ever taken place. Because, you know, I mean, look at it. Yeah, we didn't enter the war until December 1941, but everybody had a pretty good idea what was coming. There was a Second Lieutenant Hugh Foster. That's a picture of him as a Major General, who was assigned. He was a second lieutenant at the time. He was assigned to the 4th Signal Company of the 4th Infantry Division to train the Comanche code talkers. So after the exercise, they returned to Fort Benning, Georgia, where they'd come from, and that's where they started their training. So the Army started recruiting and training code talkers before the Marine Corps, but they didn't enter combat duty. They didn't employ their code talking combat duty until after the Navajo did with the Marine Corps in World War II. An interesting anecdote from that exercise, a Great Louisiana exercise. Two of the Comanche code talkers were, quote, captured by the other force. You have the blue force, the friendlies, the red force, the enemies. Well, the red force captured 2 blue force code talkers. So they started speaking among themselves after they'd been, you know, held with the, you know, and during the exercise, held there for, you know, an hour or so, and they said, look, you know, this guy likes to smoke, so the next time he smokes, he says, I'm gonna knock him down, and you take his gun and we'll escape. They were speaking, he's like, hey, you guys, quit talking, I don't know what you're saying, quit talking. Sure enough, the next guy reached into his pipe leg, so one guy kicked his legs out from under him. They took his weapon, they go, we have to kill you now, bang, pointing their finger, and then they took off. So They were able to use it in the exercise out. It's kind of cool. So there were no Native American code talkers that were officially captured during that exercise. Okay, how did they get going in the Pacific Theater? This is a picture of a gentleman named Philip Johnston. He was in the prior Army, but he heard about what was going on with read something about it, heard what was going on with the Comanches in the Great Louisiana Maneuvers, and he had grown up on a Navajo reservation, and he decided he lived in California, so he went to the Marine Corps commander there at it was either at Pendleton or another place. I don't know. We'll get to it later on. And he went into Los Angeles and found some Navajos and went and did a demonstration for the Marine Corps commandant at Camp Pendleton, I believe it was. And as a result, this letter was written from the commanding general of the Amphibious Forces Pacific to the commandant of the U.S. Marine Corps, explaining the idea, explaining that they had done a demonstration. The demonstration that Johnston arranged for the Marine Corps commandant at Camp Pendleton there was, they gemmed up a message. They says it took them 40 seconds to code, transmit, and decode this test message. To use what was then widely used as a tactical code, then the shackle code, to use that, it took over an hour for the shackle code to do what it took the Navajos 40 seconds to do. Pretty remarkable. Okay, so recruiting. Does anybody, there's a lot of old Wyomingites here. Anybody know the name A.C. Monahan? Okay. Rick, I thought maybe you might be the one that might recognize him as an educator. The War Department asked this guy, A.C. Monahan, who was the director of the Indian Service, and I haven't even been able to find out what the Indian Service, unquote, was. It might have been some part of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, I don't know. But he recommended the Comanche because it was an unwritten language. And the reason I mentioned Wyoming was everything, when I looked up A.C. Monahan, he was an educator and he was associated with trying to assess education in the West. Specifically, there was a lot about Wyoming in there, so I thought maybe someone could help me out with that. The recruiting in late 1940 began at the Anandarko Indian Agency in Oklahoma. A guy named Bill Kearny, who he was a Comanche, he worked for the Civil Conservation Corps Indian Division. And he was given authority to work with the Army to recruit these Comanche Indians for basic training and for CT training. So again, this is before the war, so they're all volunteers. Now let's talk about the Navajo and the Marine Corps. In April of 1942, the Marine Corps recruiter was given permission from the Navajo Tribal Council to recruit from Tuba City, Arizona, and some other communities nearby there where they spoke the same dialect, the right word, of Navajo. And I understand that, for instance, between the southern Navajo and the northern Navajo, I was told the word for bee in northern Navajo might mean ant in southern Navajo, that there are significant differences. So they tried to recruit the Navajo from the same area speaking. And Tuba City would be,
Coffee, for instance.
pardon me?
Even the word coffee is different from north and south.
Yeah, wow. Now, the Anandarko Agency is exactly where, and would that be southern or northern?
What?
The Anandarko Agency, would that be southern or northern Navajo?
I don't.
It may not exist anymore, but.
Anandarko, is that?
Anandarko.
That's a city in Oklahoma.
Oh, that's where they were in Oklahoma, but that's what I'm talking, I apologize, I'm getting my Comanche Navajo. Okay, Tuba City, Arizona, that was, Anandarko was that's Oklahoma, and I knew that too because I went to Tulsa, so among areas of Arizona and New Mexico where they spoke the same dialect, they recruited. So 29 Navajo, if you read about, you hear about the original 30 or the original 29. They were sworn in at Fort Wingate. That's a picture of their swearing in. New Mexico, immediately sent to Camps Edwards and Pendleton near San Diego, not just for their code training, but for their basic training, because again, all these recruits had to do basic training in addition to their code training. And since they all went into in the case of the Army, the Signal Corps, or I don't know what they call, I guess I should know in the Marine Corps, the Marine Corps version of the Army Signal Corps, they had to learn everything that everybody else had to learn in addition to developing and learning their codes. So you can understand that it would be extremely important for these recruits to be bilingual, so they had to be proficient in both English and in their native language. Who were these kids? Who were these young men? They were young Native Americans in those days were required, that didn't work out in all cases, but were required to attend Indian boarding schools. Most of these Indian boarding schools were on former Army reservations. While they were at school, they were prohibited from speaking their native languages. They lived military style in dormitories. They had a lot of regimentation, marching to and from class. Many of the agencies had uniforms for the students to wear. But then again, when they returned outside the school term, they would go home and obviously speak their native languages. Where many of them lived rugged lives on their reservation homes. Some interesting statistics here I'll share with you. Before World War II was declared, there were already 4,500 Indians serving in the armed forces. In about a year, this number more than doubled. They enlisted in a much greater percentage of population than any other segment of American society, and the Army even acknowledged that if every other segment of American society had served or volunteered at the same rate that Native Americans did, they would have not even required to have a draft. Remarkable. So think about it. Here's a people whose, in many cases, parents, and in most cases, grandparents and great-grandparents. I mean, we don't need to go into the history between, the European Americans and the Native Americans. We need to go into that. Yet, they volunteered at an amazing rate to serve the United States of America. Why is that? What motivated them to do that? To me, this is the most fascinating part of the things that I read about this. So before World War II was over, about 25,000 served in World War II. Now, outside of serving in the armed forces, the reservation population dropped dramatically because those that didn't serve in the armed forces went to serve in munition plants, arms fabrication and construction plants, building tanks and planes, and left the reservations in droves to go do this. Okay, so you can understand, why. Employment. Okay, yeah, they get a job because of employment. Historically low in reservation populations. Patriotism, and that's an interesting twist of patriotism because when Pearl Harbor was attacked, that's part of our homeland, right? Well, the Native Americans looked at it the same way, that our homeland is being attacked, regardless of who the government is. They're attacking our homeland. So that was one of the motivations. So you can call that patriotism. Another one is just assimilation. There was a big push to be assimilated among the rest of the Native American populations. And please, if you got anything to chime in on this, I'd love to hear it. Just speak up or raise your hand or something. So assimilation was part of it. But one of the most fascinating things to me was it's the warrior ethos and the status of warriors in Native American societies. And I witnessed this, Joanna and I witnessed this ourselves. We attended the Crow Fair a couple times. Yes, sir.
It'd be interesting if you were to attend Northern Cheyenne powwow and see the veterans coming in the opening ceremonies with their uniforms and headdresses, singing a song about the country defeat. In other words,
Yeah.
It's kind of a conundrum there, isn't it?
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
It's absolutely fascinating. Again, just to make a short anecdote, my wife and I were up at the Crow Fair, and this guy with a veteran's hat on, and or even older than I, came up, probably about my age, and asked us, very nice, and asked us, is there anything I can explain? So he's explaining the whole thing about the 4 directions and the whole thing, and spending, the time that we did with him, we could see that the younger members of the tribe were treating him to great deference, and it was because he was an Army veteran, he was a Vietnam veteran, and they treated him, so he has the warrior status in the tribe, even today, which I thought was fascinating. So that was another motivation. It was an opportunity for these young men, and it happened that after World War I, they would come back from fighting World War I, and their communities, their Native American communities, would hold these warrior celebrations and healing ceremonies for warrior healing ceremonies and all that sort of stuff that were completely prohibited. But because it was in a patriotic sense, because they were returning from a war, that the United States was in, the officials at the agencies completely ignored it, and that's how a lot of these ceremonies were able to regain traction in the Native American communities, which had been prohibited up to that time. So I thought that was fascinating. And the last reason was because these kids were recruited before the draft. They figured, well, we may get drafted anyway, so we get an opportunity to serve with my brother and my cousin and with my friends that served with. So that was another reason that they were motivated to do that. Okay, I know this is getting a little bit long and those seats are hard, so I'll try to speed it up a little bit. Okay, training and development. Again, they had to all go through their basic training. Fascinating thing about this as well that I learned was that the drill instructors were typically amazed that these Indian recruits, they got it before any of the other recruits did. Why is that? Well, we already talked about how when they were in the boarding schools, they had to learn how to make their bed where you can bounce a quarter off of it. They had to shine their shoes. They wore uniforms. They marched to and from class. A lot of them were great marksmen. There's stories about almost an entire squad would shoot at least sharpshooter, if not expert, at their first time on the range. For most of these kids from Brooklyn or something didn't even know which end of the gun to hold. So the drill instructors are going, there is something wrong. You guys aren't supposed to know all this sort of stuff. And in the case of the Comanches, when they went to Fort Benning, their basic training was shortened by weeks because they knocked it out. They didn't have to spend a lot of time teaching just basic military skills. They were able to get them qualified in all these areas and then start the code development and talking that much sooner. They were admired by their white counterparts. I didn't read anything about any racial incidents between the Native American code talkers and any of their counterparts from the rest of American society in basic training. They made fast friends with a lot of them. They would take them home on furlough on the weekends to their homes. Just really, really interesting and fun to read that kind of stuff. In the case of the Comanches at Fort Benning, Georgia, they had some of their, well, you can see it here, had some of their Native American dress and drums and stuff like that shipped out, and they would go to the communities around there and entertain the troops on the base, and go to other communities and entertain the communities with their Native American dances and stuff. Just really heartwarming to read how well they were accepted, and fascinating to read how fantastic they did. Well, in addition to doing their basic training, they also had to learn, because they were in the Army, and same thing in the Marine Corps, they were in the Signal Corps, so they had to learn everything that all the other guys in the Signal Corps had to learn. Any Signal Corps guys in here from the Army? Boy, great. You know what I'm talking about. Because they had to learn everything. They had to learn radio, wire, telephone, radio telephone procedures, Morse code, semaphore, field repair of all your equipment. Again, this is a South Power phone that Bob's left here that were on those wires, so they had to be able to guys running it. 2 Native American code talkers on a big old spool of wire. They have to run out a mile of wire to hook up the phones. They'd have to do that, and climb telephone poles and stuff, just like everybody else in the Signal Corps. In addition to that, they had to develop their codes. So the Army and the Marine Corps gave the code talkers their requirements for the codes. It couldn't be intelligible to develop a code. They're not just using the language to develop the code. A message couldn't be intelligible by other Native American code talkers. So if a Navajo is captured on the battlefield and he's not a code talker, he still doesn't know what the code talkers are saying. Okay? And we'll tell you how they were able to do that. Since it's unwritten, it all had to be committed to memory. So these 17 Comanche code talkers and these 29 Navajo code talkers in the Marine Corps on the opposite coast, headed to different theaters of war, they're the ones that actually developed the code themselves based on the requirements given them by their military leadership. They developed the codes themselves. So this is a little bit about how the code works, or the codes worked. I don't know if that's a decent. Where'd she go? There you are. I'm sorry. I don't know if those are helpful. Could you try to enunciate those for us and see how it would sound like? All right. Now, do the translations mean anything to you, or this is a different
And then
dialect?
dot is rabbit, and dot net, and then whoosh, very glottal, so.
Yeah.
Make sure, like you had indicated, you enunciate or say one, pronounce any part of the word differently, it changes the whole word, so yeah, so.
Wow. Thank you. Okay, so, I use the Marine gold and burgundy and the Army green to try to show the difference between them. So you can see the same term, because there were so many terms that were required to be used in tactical communications or even operational communications at a higher, maybe at the brigade level or something like that. There were no Native American terms for the military terms that they needed to use, so they would come up with things like this. There's no such thing as a machine gun, although this is pretty close. One of the Comanche said, that gun sounds like my mother's old treadle sewing machine gun, because it had a bad spoke and it made a bunch of noise. So they decided among themselves that, okay, we'll call that the sewing machine gun. And you see a bomber, J-Show was a buzzard for the Navajo, but here it was a pregnant bird because it dropped bombs. It looked like a pregnant bird because it had a big underbelly, so it dropped bombs, which probably, I don't have to look it up, maybe aerial bombs were called eggs for the Comanche, I don't know. So they had to come up with terms for all different types of aircraft: small arms, artillery, tactics, vehicles and transportation routes, all different kinds of vehicles, ships and boats, communications equipment, personnel, infantry, terrain, structures, supply points, and even nationalities in the European theater. And some of those were pretty interesting. They had a name for Hitler, crazy white man, stuff like this. So, but if you look at the bottom here, we talk about the letter R. Let's go back and think about the gold bug again, where you had a little transliteration table. One character would mean another. So if I had to spell out the name of a town in France, okay, in a message, I'm not going to spell it out in American. We do in our international phonetic alphabet, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo, blah, blah, blah. So they did the same thing here, only so the letter R, rabbit starts with R. What's the Navajo name for rabbit?
Ga.
There you go. A ram? and rice.
Well,
Okay? So what I would call the gold bug effect, in order to keep someone trying to decipher my code from figuring out if I spelled the letter THE several times in there, I didn't want to use the same Navajo phonetic word for T, so I had 3 or 4 different ones for T. So in the same message, if I had to use the word THE, the first time I use it, I would use the letter T, one translation for the letter T, and then later in the message I'd use a different phonetic translation word for the letter T in another one. So you can see pretty quickly that curve can go asymptotic, and no one's going to be able to figure that out after a while. So they had every letter of the alphabet had multiple Navajo words, which stood for a word in English that started with that letter. And that's how it worked. So beyond that, and this, I thought this was kind of interesting. You can't really read it, but it says, "He'd better talk," or something like that. And here's the guy doing smoke signals. Well, you can never get, you would never do that today because it's so such a stereotype. But this is actually the cover of their training alphabet that they developed, that the Navajos developed. So you can imagine all the terms they had to come up with, so many military terms. So a message typically in Navajo and in the Comanche would have a lot of their normal Navajo or Comanche words interspersed with all these code words. And there is an instance where the Japanese captured a Navajo Indian who was not a code talker, and he was severely tortured. He still could not understand. I understand what that would mean. I have no idea what it all means together to make sense. And he wasn't able to, even under torture, wasn't able to give away any of these messages. All right, so we'll talk about operations in the Pacific field. You'll see a lot of, I put these medallions up here and some of these things. These are just patches from the organizations that these Native Americans worked for. So that's the Marine 1st Infantry Division, 2nd, 3rd Infantry Division, and that's a medallion that was struck by the U.S. Mint. Commemorating the Navajo Code Talkers. That's an actual photograph of a couple of Navajo Code Talkers. And if you're familiar with anything, the Pacific Campaign, we started down here taking islands from the Japanese to get close enough to do our bombing raids on the mainland of Japan. So these are the islands that they went through. So the first deployment of the Navajos for code talking, they deployed to New Caledonia, which is off the East Australian coast, to continue their training. The original 29 code talkers are the ones that trained all the rest of them. So a couple of them were held back to train the additional ones that were recruited, but they eventually all got into operations. The teams were usually used in teams of 2, so you had a radio operator and then a transcriber operate the radio. So one would listen, the other would write down in English what he heard in the Navajo code. And the Comanches operated the same way in the European theater. They were dispersed among different ships, regiments, and battalions. You couldn't put them all together because if a ship was sunk and you had all your code talkers there goes your code talking ability. Plus, when they were deployed into this island hopping, all these amphibious landings, they were already with the organizations they would be working with. That's how they were employed. Interesting thing, in the Marines were the nature of combat and the island hopping campaigns with the things like that. The code talkers were right there, embedded in the landing troops and stuff like that, because that was just the nature of warfare versus, with the exception of D-Day, that was the nature of the warfare over there. So they were exposed to a lot more enemy fire than were the Comanches in the European theater. A few were killed, at least one by friendly fire. At least one more actually was killed in the water during the landing. Several were wounded. All were decorated. They fought with the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions, and also at least one Army Division, the 81st, and they fought all the way through the island hopping campaign. Household words: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Bougainville, Kwajalein, Inuitak, Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and they were extremely successful. One anecdote that I'll share with you on Peleliu, the U.S. Army 81st Division was there with the Marines. So 2 GIs saw these 2 Japs in Marine Corps uniforms in a foxhole with a radio and captured them. What are you Japs? Where'd you get those uniforms? Hey, we're not Japs, we're Americans. Yeah, we're Navajo. Yeah. Listen to it, we speak perfect English. Yeah, well, a lot of Japs can speak English. And they almost decided, these 2 GIs almost decided to kill these guys. Finally, one of the Native American code talkers said, look, there's a communications post about 800 yards on the other side of that ridge. Please go over there, they'll vouch for us. So one guy left and held the gun on the 2 code talkers. The other guy came back with a major who actually went through his Army counterpart and had these guys punished in some way for capturing two Marines. But pretty tight little moment there. The Japanese, there's no evidence that the code was ever broken. The Japanese couldn't make any sense of it, as I mentioned, even under torture. All right, let's go back over the European theater. The first use of Native American code talkers was 8 Meskwaki, which is a Sac and Fox tribe that were trained as code talkers. Don't know a lot about them. They're from the Iowa National Guard. They participated in that big training event in Louisiana that I talked about. Oh, wrong one. Got ahead of myself. There we go. So there's the Meskwaki medallion, and they were in the 34th Infantry Division. That's their patch. And this is actually the 8 code talkers with their officer. Don't know a whole lot about it, except the fact that they would go out they landed in North Africa, and ended up fighting through Italy. But they would typically move out 1 or 2 miles ahead of the American troops in those horrible desert conditions to report enemy movements. And again, they also took part in the Italian campaign after the North African campaign was over. Okay, now we're going to go back to the Comanche. Again, they used teams of 2 operators, a talker and a recorder. They were used primarily, with the exception of right at the landings in D-Day, they were used primarily at divisional and regimental headquarters, with headquarter and battalion level infantry and artillery units. They had to perform all their other Signal Corps duties, as I said before. They were used mostly in crucial tactical situations, reporting friendly and enemy force locations, and also calling in direct fire in many cases. Most of them landed on the 1st or 2nd day of D-Day, not in the first wave or 2, but following that they were. One of the guys, Larry Salpiti, was the orderly and driver for Brigadier General Teddy Roosevelt Jr. I don't know if you all know, obviously Teddy Roosevelt's son died in a heart attack in theater, but he probably sent the first Comanche message in the European theater on D-Day. Another code talker who was a Choctaw, a guy named Schlicht Billy, the 45th Infantry Division, single-handedly took a pillbox, which was the first breach of the German Siegfried Line, which is on the German's western border. For that, he was wounded, got the Silver Star with oak leaf cluster, in addition, obviously, to his Purple Heart. Oop, too far. How do I go back? There'd be a way to go back. Previous, sweet, okay. The Comanche Code Talkers participated in every 4th Infantry Division engagement, including Overlord D-Day, the Hurtgen Forest, the Battle of the Bulge, even concentration camp liberations. One little anecdote that I really enjoyed was they were out one time and they saw a deer, and it was a lull in the fighting. And of course, in Battle of the Bulge, it was cold as everything. And there's the uniform there. So they shot a deer, brought it back. Said, "Can you cook this?" And the cook said, "Hell yeah, I'd cook it." "You get any more?" "Yeah, we get some more." So they got the company commander come back. They took a Jeep with a 30 caliber machine gun, went out and killed 6 more deer and fed the whole company for 2 days. All of the Comanche Code Talkers survived the war, although some were wounded. Okay, the post-war period. Again, I mentioned before that when they got back from World War II, they were celebrated by their communities upon returning. They were honored, welcomed home and honored in traditional ceremonies. Again, just like any other returning GI, they suffered what we call today PTSD. So that they were able to, and I have more information from it than ever, they were able to go through, you can explain Navajo singings and sand paintings, which are part of healing ceremonies.
Restoration and balance, yes.
Restoration and balance ceremonies, which are
Harmony,
fascinating.
so, yes,
Yep.
after everything that they had gone through.
Yeah, yeah. And in some cases, they worked when other PTSD, what we call PTSD treatments, didn't work on some of the returning warriors. Again, they suffered, and we all know the story. They suffered a lot from alcoholism. Many came back and flourished, but many were discouraged by the lack of societal change toward Native Americans. They go over there and they put their lives on the line, fight through the whole war, and they come back and they get treated like second-class citizens, just like before they left. And it's a shame. And like I said, many states won't even allow them to vote. Okay, recognition. You've seen a lot of these medallions. All of the tribes that have been documented as participating as code talkers, coins were struck. Congressional gold medal was given to the tribes. As I understand it, the individuals that were honored were given silver versions of the same medals. The U.S. Mint did those in addition to all these commemorative coins. And in 2016, the Sacagawea coins, some of those are Native American code talker commemorative coins. You can see here some ceremonies held, President Bush, President Obama, President Trump, awarding, giving some of these awards. Also, there's a huge Code Talkers Memorial at Window Rock, Arizona for the Navajo. The National Cryptologic Museum has an exhibit there in the lower left-hand corner. There's countless celebrations at VFWs, American Legion halls, across the nation, parades, you name it. The last surviving Navajo Native American Code Talker is a guy named Chester Nez. I encourage you to read his book. It's called Code Talker, and it's co-written with a younger person who helped him write the book. It's fascinating. And the gentleman here on the right is the last surviving Comanche Code Talker, a guy named Charles Chickbiddy. Okay. What's the legacy of these Native American Code Talkers? On the left is a Choctaw chief, Pushmata. There's an War of 1812 uniform there. He fought as a general for the United States of America in the War of 1812. So there's been a long legacy, as we know from the Scouts and everything else, of Native Americans fighting the U.S. Armed Forces. That's just an interesting example. Goes on to this day. But the Navajo and the Choctaw and all the other Code Talkers have created a lot more interest in Native Americans than the armed forces that weren't Code Talkers, serving and veterans alike. This is an Army guy in Germany who's giving a presentation to all of the Army people at, I think, Kaserne or something in Germany. That's part of the legacy, and of course, a tombstone there. I know everybody's giving me the signal to keep going, but I do have a really short video that I want you to see. These are some of the resources that I use. It'll only take me a second to set this up. If I can get this right.
I took the oath the 17th of September 1946. I was so proud because I was able to join the Marine. During the boot camp, went to rifle range. I shot expert the first day. Then final, the next day, I shot shooter. After rifle, and then we have completed the boot camp, and I made it private first class, one stripe. I was ordered to Camp Pendleton. I went inside, I couldn't believe it. There's a whole bunch of Navajos. I didn't know none of them. So I asked the sergeant Benali, I said, I'm in the wrong place, sir. I said, I asked to be an area gunning. I want to go to area gunner school. So that's too bad. You're here. This is Code Talker School. And you're Navajo. Therefore, they sent you here. We're going to teach you Navajo code. Japanese, they knew every code, and they broke every code that the United States had. Our code was never broken by anyone, even by Navajos. For example, alphabet was the first one that they worked on it. A, Willachi. Next one was the Lasana, which means apple. All the way down the line, the letter J is jackass. That was a funny one. At the same time, they come up with a new word, mostly weapons like artillery, call it some sun, lots of guns. Mortar, call it sitting gun. My unit, 5th Marine Division, landed on Iwo Jima, February 19, 1945. We used Navajo code 100% the first 48 hours. We sent close to 800 messages without a mistake. My unit, 5th Marine Division, like so much. February 23rd, 1945. We were so proud when we saw that coming. We did something for our country. I'm proud of it. Veterans Day. It's the most important day for everybody to respect all of them that serve in the military. So I would say to veteran, welcome home. Thank you for your services. All of you, thank you very much for serving your country. Day and night, these days, Marine.
That's it. All right, I know the weather's getting lousy out there. Really lousy. That's why they were giving me this. So have a safe trip home. I'm happy to answer any questions. Maybe you want to do it separately, so come on up so people can leave. But thanks a lot for coming. so much of it. Well, their auditoriums are too long.
Well, it could be something that you could find.
Yeah, like on that. HB Puckett.
Mike Lazar,
Mike, nice meeting you.
double EA.
Say again?
That's a double EA.
Is it? Good. So you're the Army guy. You would know. You're this Army Signal Corps guy, right?
That was the machine you used, KL7.
Yeah.
7 discs still work. Like
Yeah, yes. That's 7, exactly. Yeah.
500 word group.
Yep, exactly.
I was still using.
Yeah, we had a KW7, KG7, KW and KG14s,
Yeah.
42s. I remember all that.
We were still using those in 1962. I don't know when they finally phased them
Oh,
out.
they used them for quite a while. I think those were some of the first things that I got rid of when I got my CMS.
Yeah. Then they,
You were in the Army? Nope. You were in the Army? Signal.
then they sold them later on.
Say thank you. I'm Kiva McCarthy. Yes, yes. I live in Buffalo. I find out what you have.
Very few people recognize historic significance. They can read with electronic grenade or a pen. Grenade.
I don't remember when the songs
I lived in Chicago. The Chicago area. I grew up in the area. Suburbs. There was a place called Maxwell City. And they dealt with surplus, of course, hardware and everything. They sold a lot of surplus stuff around the industry or the military. And they had rolls of those things. Floor to ceiling warehouse of boxes of those things. You can pick them up for a couple of bucks.
I know.
Yeah, there's a whole, I mean, here, you can add as much as you, yeah, as much as you can.
Well, even to this day, American school
Thank you.